Hello and welcome to another video in my Fundamentals of Orchestration series. Today I'll be discussing how to orchestrate or arrange a melody for the string section of the orchestra. I'll be demonstrating this concept using the melody from the song Poor Wayfaring Stranger, and I'll be using orchestral sample libraries, mostly from Orchestral Tools. Let's get started. There are several things to keep in mind when writing or arranging a melody for strings. Some questions you might want to ask yourself are, what is the intended emotional response from the audience? What should the dynamics be? Which of the string instruments do I need? And what register should the melody be in? These are all things to consider even before writing the first notes. I want to start by talking about the different strings on each string instrument. If you've never played a string instrument, you may not realize that each of the 4 strings on a string instrument is unique. Each string has its own character and timbre that can shape the sound of a melody, from dark and rich to brilliant and bright. Let's start by looking at the violin. The lowest string on the violin is the G string. The approximate range is from G3 to G4, although the upper end has some flexibility. Generally, for each string instrument, the 3 lower strings have a range of about an octave, and the upper strings have roughly a 2-octave range. That's not to say you can't go higher on the lower strings, but these are the typical ranges that the string player feels comfortable using. The G string on the violin is rich, full, and dark. The upper part of the string has an intensity and expressiveness that composers will often call for by indicating sol G over a melody that otherwise would be played on the D string. The D string has a range from D4 to D5, and is overall less dark and less full sounding. It has a very mellow quality and is often used for song-like melodies. The A string has a range from A4 to A5 and is overall a bit brighter than the 2 lower strings. Finally, the E string has an approximate range from E5 to E7 and is brilliant, bright, and piercing in its highest range. Although a violinist can go higher than the E7, this is a safe, practical range for orchestral writing. Next up is the viola. The lowest string on the viola is the C string, with a range from C3 to C4. It is the most resonant part of the viola and can sound dark and rich in timbre. The G string has a range of G3 to G4 and is more neutral in timbre than the C string. It has a harder time projecting or cutting through the texture. Like the G string, the D string is somewhat neutral and does not project well. It has a range from D4 to D5. Lastly, the A string has an approximate range of A4 to E6 and has a beautiful reedy quality, perhaps somewhat nasal in timbre. It's much more able to carry a melody in an orchestral texture than either of the 2 middle strings. The cello strings are tuned the same as the viola, only an octave lower. The C string has a range of C2 to C3 and is rich, full-bodied, and very resonant. The cello is capable of powerful and somewhat dark melodies in this range. The G string has a range from G2 to G3, and like the C string, is rich and warm in timbre, although less powerful. The D string has a range of D3 to D4, and is a bit brighter in timbre. It has a silky and intimate quality that makes it a prime choice for many lyrical melodies. Finally, the A string with a range from A3 to about A5 has a vibrant and brilliant quality. At higher dynamics, it is most capable of penetrating through the orchestral textures. The contrabass, or sometimes referred to as double bass, or simply bass, is the only string instrument from the orchestra tuned in fourths, meaning the interval between open strings on the bass is a fourth instead of a fifth. This is because the physical distance between stopped notes is larger the lower you go in register. Hand positions for bassists would be much more difficult if tuned in fifths. It's worth noting that some basses have a fifth string, a B string, a fourth below the E string. This is more common in Europe, and most composers will avoid these notes when writing for orchestra. In most professional orchestras, some, or perhaps even all of the bassists, will have a C extension, which can extend the range of the lowest string down to C. If you write notes down in this range, there's always a chance that the bassist will simply play up the octave. The E string of the bass has a range from E1 to E2 and is rich, full-bodied, and very resonant. Exact pitch in this range can be somewhat difficult to decipher at times, and just to give you some context, the frequency of E1 is around 40 Hz. The low range of human hearing is somewhere around 20 to 25 Hz, so we're getting pretty close to that. This is one reason why orchestrators might consider doubling these notes up an octave, or simply choosing notes on the A string to be the fundamental of the chord. The A string has a range of A1 to A2 and is clearer and less boomy than the E string. The D string has a range of D2 to D3 and is dark and full-bodied. The G string has an approximate range of G2 to G4, and just like the D string, is dark in timbre. Of course, the ranges of each string instrument can be extended using harmonics, and the bass is perhaps the easiest of the 4 string instruments to produce harmonics, but I won't go into too much detail on harmonics here, as I've already covered them in a previous video in this series. Most symphony orchestras will arrange the strings in this position, with violins left of the conductor, violas near the middle, cellos just to the right, and basses far to the right. There will be subtle variations on this positioning scheme depending on the size of the orchestra or personal decisions by a specific conductor or ensemble, but this is fairly universal. If you've never written for orchestra or attended a live performance, you may be surprised to see 2 separate violin sections, whereas each of the remaining string instruments are in just one section. Having a violin 1 section as well as a violin 2 section has been the norm for hundreds of years, and I think that there are 2 major reasons why this is the case. First, it's a simple matter of balancing. In general, the larger the body of the instrument, the more volume that instrument will produce, so the string orchestra will require the fewest number of basses and the greatest number of violins to have equal balance between sections. Another reason for having 2 violin sections touches upon an issue I discussed in a previous video in this series, the harmonic series. There's simply more room in the frequency spectrum for instruments in the upper register, and notes in the violin's range will naturally be thinner sounding than those in the bass's range. Having an additional section to fill out harmonies and melodies in the upper register provides another type of balance to the overall sound of the orchestra. The exact numbers of each section will vary from orchestra to orchestra. A large symphonic orchestra might consist of 16 first violins, 14 second violins, 12 violas, 10 celli, and 8 basses, while a smaller orchestra might have around 8 firsts, 6 seconds, 5 violas, 5 cellos, and 4 basses. Composers tend not to have to think about this too often, although there are times when using divises where it is convenient to know just how many of each are available. Composers writing for sampled orchestras will be much more aware of sizes, as sample libraries are recorded with a specific number of players in a specific hall. I'll play an excerpt from my orchestra piece, Wayfaring Stranger, first using solo strings from Orchestral Tools' First Chairs library. The individual qualities of each string instrument are on full display here, and the overall expressiveness and intimacy sets it apart from section strings. While the majority of orchestral string writing is full section or perhaps half section writing, using soloists on occasion can provide a wonderful color and texture. The next example is using the quarter section patches from Spitfire's Studio Strings Professional. There are 4 violin 1s, 3 violin 2s, 3 violas, 3 celli, and because Spitfire didn't include divisi sections for the basses, I used the full 4 bass patch. Obviously, the recording space is much different, but you can still get a sense of the individuality of players and a more chamber orchestral texture. Next up is Berlin strings with 8 violin 1s, 6 violin 2s, 5 violas, 5 celli, and 4 basses. It's rather small for a full orchestra, but it maintains a bit of the intimate texture of a chamber orchestra and can still achieve the raw power of a large ensemble. The last example is from Spitfire's Symphonic Strings library, with 16 firsts, 14 seconds, 12 violas, 10 celli, and 8 basses. This is a fairly standard modern symphony orchestra size, although the space it was recorded in is quite a bit more reverberant. Overall, it's a lot richer and perhaps even heavier sounding than Berlin strings. The string section is capable of such a wide variety of sonic characters, timbres, styles, and emotions. Today I want to focus on writing lyrical melodies with strings. I'll look specifically at unison and octave melody writing. In the next video, I'll look at writing homophonic and polyphonic string melodies and textures. Because of each instrument's large range and wide variety of dynamics, bow techniques, and articulations, it's a good idea to think strongly about how you'd like your melody to sound before actually working out the details of the arrangement. It may help to come up with a few descriptive adjectives that might help guide you in your decisions about register, dynamics, and technique. Let's say I wanted my melody to sound melancholic. I might choose a lower dynamic marking, with strings in the middle register, perhaps the violins on their D string, or the violas on either of their middle 2 strings, or the cello on its D string, or some combination of all of them. In terms of bow techniques or articulations, I might choose to mute the strings to remove some of the higher frequencies, and I might also choose to limit how much vibrato is used. These aren't the only techniques, dynamics, and registers that would work for this descriptive word. They're just personal choices and might be different from composer to composer. These kinds of choices are partly what make each artist have a unique sound. Let's take a look at the main melody from Poor Wayfaring Stranger to see how these decisions can drastically change the timbre and aesthetic of a melody. I'll refrain from discussing the actual composition or form of the melody, so we can just focus on adapting this to strings. It would be impossible to demonstrate all of the different combinations of dynamics, registers, bow techniques, instruments used for this melody, so I'll just share a few. The first example has violins 1 and 2, violas, and celli in unison in the key of A minor, the A in the middle of the treble clef starting at A4. This means the violins are on their A string, which will be slightly bright but not piercing. The violas on their A string will add some warmth and expressiveness to the violins, and the celli are high up on their A string and will add intensity to the overall sound. If your goal is intensity here, you might actually consider moving the violins up an octave. The next example is the same thing but an octave lower. The violins are now on their G string, and that creates a warmer, more intense sound. think that this version has a clearer identity than the previous one, and the instruments seem to blend more easily. You'll notice I'm not including basses here because I think that they'd only add muddiness to the sound. Now let's listen to just the violins on their own. The intensity that they bring is now more focused without the violas and celli. And here are the violas and celli alone. There's a greater sense of lyricism and expressiveness because of where the melody lies on these instruments. Next up we have violins an octave up from the celli and violas. Some of the dark, rich intensity is gone now from the violins, and the more mellow sound of the A string fits well with the lyricism of the lower strings. So now I've bumped the first violins up the octave and removed the lower strings. This octave unison violin writing is extremely common in orchestral literature, as the upper octave adds intensity and power, while the lower octave thickens the sound a bit. Also very common is this next configuration, where violins 1 and 2 are on the high octave, violas an octave lower, adding warmth and lyricism, and celli an octave below that. This arrangement sits in a very expressive range for each instrument, so the overall sound is great for thicker, textured, expressive moments, even if the brass and winds are present. The next version has the basses and celli an octave apart. On the staff, the basses are always written an octave above sounding pitch. This low string configuration has a great sense of power and intensity. Both the basses and celli are dark, rich, and a bit ominous in this range. If we add the violas to that, an octave higher, we slightly mellow out the sound. And if then we add the violins on top of that, at the same octave as the violas, we build on the intensity and richness of the basses and celli. So far I've shown just one dynamic level, as to not change too many things at once, but of course changing dynamics has a major effect on the overall sound. Let's say we want something more grandiose. We probably want to increase the dynamic markings and also spread out the instrument's ranges. Also, to increase intensity, you might want to increase the number of separated bowings, which allows the player to use more bow pressure and volume for each note. I've also only shown one bow technique thus far, just regular normal bowing. What happens if you decrease the dynamics and make the players play up on the fingerboard? This technique is called sol tasto and creates a more fragile sound with fewer high harmonics. So that's all that I'm going to show in this video, but I'll pick up where I left off in the next video. And I'll be talking about harmonizing a melody and adding more articulations and techniques. See you next time.